An open source app just hit #1 on the App Store, and I couldn't be more excited. It's awesome seeing how apps actually work and all the cool stuff going on underneath. In case you haven't been keeping up, the app is Bluesky, an alternative to Twitter that has a really interesting history. I want to dive into the history, why this app is finding success, as well as the tech behind it and what we can all learn from it. I think it's a really cool project. I've been using the app for a while now. Follow me over there, by the way, at t3.gg. But first, we need to understand the history. Before that, though, we need a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is me, because I couldn't get an ad in time for this. Turns out having 2+ videos a day is kind of hard to maintain sponsors for. If you're interested in filling spots like this in the future, getting your brand put in front of the most talented Senior Plus developers watching YouTube, period, let me know. Hit us up, youtube@t3.gg. It's important to understand where Bluesky came from, because obviously it's a Twitter alternative. But what you might not have known is this Twitter alternative started at Twitter. Yes, Jack, the original CEO of Twitter, made a post back in 2019 about funding a small independent team of up to 5 open source architects to build a new open standard. Jack always wanted Twitter to be an open platform some amount, and a lot of Twitter's early success came from the APIs. Originally, back in 2007, you could just SMS send a tweet to a random phone number that they had, and that was how you would post on mobile before smartphones were a thing. That's also why the character limit originally existed, so you could get tweets back and forth over SMS with the same character limits. Over time, the API became pretty good, and people started using that for all sorts of things, and a lot of Twitter's original success came from the use of those APIs. Obviously, since then, the APIs have been slowly walked back, especially now since that logo changed. The APIs are a lot less accessible, and now they cost a lot of money. Thankfully, Bluesky went the other way, and it's a much more open standard, lets you do even more stuff. But the history of how we got here is interesting. As we're showing here, this was a request for proposals, for people to submit what they think this new open solution could look like. A developer named Jay Graber was the winner. Hopefully I pronounced her last name right. She came in with a great proposal and quickly took over, and starting in 2021, became the CEO of this new project, Bluesky. For various reasons, Bluesky quickly became an independent company, but they were still getting their funding from Twitter up until a certain acquisition happened and that funding dried up. Thankfully, they don't have to rely on Twitter for funding anymore, because they raised $15 million in their Series A, and they plan to launch subscriptions at some point. Awesome. They had a seed raise before that for $8 million, and they just raised another 15. That was October of this year. Cool. So they're in a pretty good spot. They got plenty of cash, and they're building something really cool here. I want to break apart the 3 pieces that contribute to Bluesky so that we can look at them and talk about them in a more direct way. The part that you guys are probably thinking of when I say it's an open source app that just hit #1 on the App Store is the app itself, which in this case is a React Native app using Expo, both for native on iOS and Android, as well as for web, which has really interesting pieces to dig into. There is the Bluesky servers, which I'm pretty sure are open source. I'd be surprised if they weren't, but this part isn't that interesting. We might dive into it a bit. The most interesting part, at Proto. There's a lot to dive into here. It's a new way of thinking of how data is routed on the web. It's almost like a sequel to RSS in a lot of ways, and I think it's really, really cool. So yeah, we have a lot to dive into here, but let's get started with the app. Here it is, the React Native app. The whole thing is just here on GitHub for anyone to do whatever they want with. The web version, iOS version, and Android version are all served from here. So yes, that does mean they're using React Native for web, which has benefits and negatives. I'll be honest, the website works plenty fine. It's actually kind of funny that they're using React Native for web. If you're not familiar, I should do a quick overview of what React Native for web is before we go too deep here, because I'll get lost in the sauce otherwise. I've covered the relationship between React and the actual DOM a few times by now. This is meant to be a super quick overview. Effectively, with React, you have your virtual representation of what every node on the page is, and those are represented in this thing called the virtual DOM. And every element here maps directly to something on the HTML side. So when it changes, React will check what changed in that virtual layer and then take whatever the differences are and apply those to the actual DOM. The thing that does this transition and this translation between the virtual representation of the components and the actual DOM, it's a lot of layers, but an important layer to understand is one called React DOM. Whenever you're using something like body or nav or any of these HTML elements in your React code, That's coming from React DOM. And if you're using React to build a web app, you have React DOM installed. Whether or not you know it, it is one of those packages that is doing that. React Native is an alternative to React DOM that allows for React code to render to things that aren't just normal DOM HTML stuff. That's why when you look at React Native code, you don't have div or span. Instead, you have text and view. Should be the opposite order. You get the point. But this also means if you want to render text in a React Native app, you have to wrap it in text. You can't just dump it wherever like you can in HTML. And if you want a view, works kind of like div, not fully. The reason for this is if you have a concept of text or view, these can be different things in different platforms. On iOS, it can work one way, and on Android, it can work a different way. But what about web? Well, it turns out you can just turn the view into div and the text into span, and it works on web as well. This discovery happened, believe it or not, at Twitter. Because Twitter, despite not using React Native for mobile, wanted to rebuild their web app. And the goal of rebuilding the web app was to make a code base anyone could confidently contribute to without doing something that they had determined was not good, even if though it's part of web standards. One of the issues with the web is since the protocol and the standard for the web is so absurdly large, like horrifyingly large, it's a little bit too easy to footgun yourself and do things in ways that don't make sense. Like if I'm building a React app using React DOM, I can still stuff a marquee tag in or a center tag in or use these other elements that you almost certainly shouldn't be using anymore. But React Native is a layer. So you can't just call div in React Native. You can't just call marquee in React Native. Which means if you build a React Native binding for web, you can restrict the subset of things that developers are allowed to do. And the reason React Native for web started at Twitter was with that goal in mind. It was to let the platform people build the subset of things on the web that they wanted Twitter employees to be able to do and use, using React Native as the layer on top. So believe it or not, Twitter's website uses React Native and their mobile apps use native technologies, no React at all. Just always thought that was interesting, especially because that's the history of where React Native for web came from. And what's even more interesting now is with Bluesky, they're building everything with React Native, both the mobile apps as well as the web. There are more complications. It's not as simple as swapping the types of elements around. Something that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough, and I've honestly planned on doing a video on this for a while, is how routing works. With the web, you have one stack. So if I go to my profile on Bluesky, for example, and then I see a post that I like, I'll click that post and imagine that this is a stack. So in that stack, I now have a new element on top that is, let's get the actual URL for one. Profile, here's a post of mine. So now I have this post above it in the stack. Above that, let's say I click somebody else's reply, or I see somebody else reply and I go to their profile and let's say I go to Jane's profile. Now this is my stack for my history in the browser. I went from profile to my post to Jane's profile. And when I click the back button, we're effectively just taking things off of this stack. All makes sense so far. Where things start to differ between web and mobile is when you start doing other things here. Like if I go to replies on web, what's going to happen, and I'm pretty sure they're doing it this way here. I'm just going to confirm by pasting. They don't do anything actually. Cool. So this is very much built the native way. I'm happy to use this example because I just changed tabs here from posts to replies. And if I refresh, it's going to bring me back to posts because this state isn't part of my history. It's not part of the URL. And there's a reason for this. It's a very interesting one too. The reason this is the case is because mobile navigation works fundamentally differently. The stack isn't just a history of URLs, and the stack isn't just one direction up and down. You can also go left and right when you hit a certain point. I've been meaning to do a dedicated video on how native apps and web apps differ, not like technically speaking, but on like the fundamental navigation levels, the primitives levels, and all of these parts. And routing is one of the most important pieces of this. So I think this, hopefully, the way the left and right part here works can give you a taste of what that long video would look like. Again, let me know in the comments if I should do that video. It's one I've been thinking about for a while, and even have a few people from my team who've been pressuring me to do it. So yeah, I will stop sidetracking on that part and instead focus on the app itself, because the whole thing is open source and on GitHub. There's a lot we can learn from this app, and not just us like devs making apps, but even the React Native team itself, because Dan Abramov now works full-time on Bluesky and has been both finding things that are important for actually building apps with React and React Native, as well as being willing to dog food some of the really cool new things happening, specifically the React compiler. Bluesky was one of the first apps on the App Store that went all in on React compiler, and they saw some good, serious performance wins. But they've also found some issues with React Native itself, like the input stuff that I did a video about a few weeks before. The controlled inputs performance problems were killing the app, which is why Dan Abramov went on the huge, I don't want to say tirade because that sounds derogatory in a way I don't mean for it to, but his arc of calling out the performance issues with controlled inputs started because of the work he's doing here. React itself is getting better as a result of the work Bluesky is doing, and it's awesome to see. Enough of that stuff, though. Let's actually take a look at the things that are interesting. I know I say start your work in a new repo going to the pull requests tab, not the code tab, but at the very least I want to look at the dependencies because there's some important things here. We have Expo HTML elements, Expo Webpack config. I'm sure we got a lot more Expo if we scroll a bit. Here we are. Notice that. We got Expo itself as well as all of these. If you're not already familiar with Expo, you can think of them kind of like the Next and the Vercel of React Native. It's genuinely really hard to use React Native without Expo. I wouldn't even recommend using React Native without Expo at this point. It's so hilariously easy to spin up an app and also get it to the App Store. And they've done all of this shared work that's obnoxious. Everything from taking that React Native bundle and turning that into an app, to the actual App Store submission process, to building all of the native things in a way that we can access them through JavaScript. One of my favorite things to read through whenever I'm feeling like too good about my code and I want to be insecure again is the packages folder on the Expo GitHub. The number of things they have built is unbelievable. Everything from like, you want to detect faces in your app. Expo Face Detector will use the native SDKs on iOS and Android to give you face detection. If you want to have haptics in your app, Expo Haptics will call the right native APIs to make things buzz when you hit them on the phone. If you want to have images or an image picker or hell, an image manipulator, all of these things have native tools on iOS and Android that are otherwise obnoxious to build the bindings for, and they've just built them for you. A big blue pill moment for me was when I was diving deeper into Expo at a small startup I was working at a while back. And I had a native Android dev who was also pretty good at iOS, who had never really touched React or JavaScript at all. Obviously hesitant, but was more open than most to giving this all a real shot. We were doing a lot of audio and a little bit of video playback stuff in the app, so we needed to use something for that. This dev happened to be an expert on AV playback in Android specifically. And I sent him the Expo AV package, which apparently now isn't the right way to do video. You're supposed to use the new Expo video package. But at the time, back in 2021, Expo AV was the way to do it. And when I showed him this package, he hit me up with an essay, blown away with it, because it did all the things that he would have done, which was really, really cool to hear from a person who was like an expert in the native tech for that one platform. Expo AV effectively gave people who don't know what they're doing, like in that case, myself, the ability to have the quality of code you would previously have to hire an expert native engineer for. And that's my possibly favorite way of thinking about what Expo provides, is they were the expert native engineers building things correctly for all these different platforms so that now we as JS devs can consume them and build apps well. Because again, React Native isn't a browser inside of your phone. React Native is native. You are calling native APIs. You are drawing native views. You're doing everything natively. Expo is one of the groups of people exposing as much of that native functionality as possible to us as app devs so that we can build great apps that feel native because they are native. And we're doing less and less of the work in the JS layer and more of it on the native layer and just call it via JavaScript. And at that point, it doesn't even matter what language you're calling it with, because the important piece is that native code that was written for us for all major platforms. I've been a very happy Expo user and even a subscriber to their deployment platform for a long time. Highly recommend checking them out. They even offered to sponsor a dedicated video, and I turned them down because I can just show them genuinely because I actually really like the product. I cannot imagine building a mobile app at all without Expo. And hopefully now with that background, it makes a lot more sense why Expo has this many packages inside of here. Because if you want to use any of these things from blur, yes, native blur is a much harder problem than it sounds like. So if you want to have a blurred view anywhere, Expo is the way to do it. Like, it's so nice to have all of these things using native stuff. Yeah. Good old HLS.js. You can never kill this package. Playback of video is a tough problem to solve. Why is there so much Lodash in here? What? Where did that all come from? We also have a pile of these React Native helper packages. These ones aren't by Expo, but I'm positive Expo has contributed a lot to a handful of them. Apparently, Bluesky has their own fork of React Native progress here, which makes a lot of sense. Anyways, there's also a ton of dev deps. These are all just things that run in dev, so you don't have to worry too much about them, but yeah, there's a lot. Especially all these at types, because a handful of these packages don't have types in them directly. All the Expo ones do, so you'll notice that there are no Expo things here for type definitions, because it's all modern, just config stuff. I was lucky enough to have a chat with Dan at ReactConf this year, and it was his first time getting to talk with React people after working on a pretty big, heavy React app for months at that point. Previously, most of Dan's work was with libraries, with communication and education, and with React library itself, but not so much so actually building big apps with React. He helped a good bit with like the Facebook move to the new React stuff with the new Facebook site, but didn't have as much time in the trenches just building and working in a giant app and learning all the ways people use React outside of Meta. With Bluesky, he has went deep and quickly started to see some of the light that we have been living in for a while, specifically around React Query. It was very fun getting to chat with Dan at ReactConf a few months in, all about React Query and the patterns that he was using to build things nowadays. And there's some really good stuff in here if you take a look. All of this data is coming from at Bsky Feed Generator, at Bsky Graph List. We'll go in depth on how all of the at Proto stuff works in just a little bit, but know it's really cool and know that you could build your own clone of this app using their data very, almost hilariously easy. But the fun parts are when we scroll down a bit and we get to these use hooks. We have use feed source info query, which takes in a URI. It gets a type from that URI. It gets an agent from their use agent hook. And then it returns a use query that has all of these important pieces that they thought were useful, specifically the stale time and the query key that they're generating programmatically so that all of these queries will be synchronized properly. And then the query function here. What's cool with this is now you have this named hook, use feed source info query, that handles everything from stale time, keying, invalidation, revalidation, and more. And if we look at the other things, like the get popular feed query, this one's an infinite query. So this also handles pagination for you. It might seem weird to just take a React query and wrap it with one layer, so when there's only one line on top like this. What you need to understand is how useful this is if you consume this in multiple places to have one source of truth for how it behaves. And now you can reuse that without having to build an external state management library like you might have before with Redux, which, by the way, Dan Abramov made. And this code base doesn't use Redux. It uses the hell out of React Query, but you don't need that type of state management anymore. And Dan himself has even said you don't really need Redux anymore. And hopefully this code base and the cool things he's done in it will help you understand a bit more of why. Here's another fun with a programmatic query key, where depending on which type of session you are, we pin different things and map different things to set this key. We also grab preferences, where if a user has pinned feeds or has preferences for what should be loaded in, you can bind all of that in here with this enabled flag. It's super nice. It shows you how to compositionally create these data flows in a real React or React Native app. It's cool. And this isn't an app that's just like a fun side project. This has a lot of code in it. You know what? I want to know how much code. 211,000 lines of code, to be specific. 121,000 of those are TypeScript. 1,325 files, over 1,000 TS files. This is not a small code base. This is a legit project. It's honestly so cool to have a real production app like this, fully open source, so we can look and see what it means to ship production apps like this. It's also cool to see them using, for the most part, modern tools and not just open sourcing some old broken thing, but really focusing on doing stuff right and setting an example of how to maintain apps for long windows over time. But that's just the app side. As I showed earlier, we have other layers to go through here. We have the actual servers, but more importantly, at Proto. And I think understanding at Proto is important before we even dive into the servers. So what is at Proto? Well, you might have noticed on the app, my handle is a domain, t3.gg, which is my domain. And if we look at other people replying, many of them have domains because we're all fellow nerds here, but many of them don't. If we scroll a bit further, I'm sure we can find a few people who are not. Like Hot Girl Spring is .bsky.social, which is the default TLD on here. We have Sunil here, one of the original React team members, also .bsky.social, because they haven't bound a domain. which, to be frank, only nerds are going to do. This is the ultimate nerd platform for tech people like us. Oh shit, am I not following Jabril's yet? Let me fix that quick. So what does that mean? Like, why is a domain here? Why does any of this matter? What's going on? This is all based on a protocol called the @proto. This is from Paul, who works on Bluesky directly. If you're curious why everyone's username is a domain, it's because every user is essentially a website. A common thought by devs is, couldn't you make a social network using RSS? And we basically went, yeah, let's try that premise with some tweaks. Apps like Bluesky are aggregators. They crawl around the atmosphere like a search engine would crawl the web, but instead of making a search app, it makes a social app. Keywords here are aggregator, very important as we dive in more, and atmosphere, which is what @proto actually stands for. I thought it was like an symbol protocol, but it's actually atmosphere. They're trying to build a layer outside of a business and servers that is an open layer for doing typed data decentralized. I don't want to go too deep on like what each of those words mean when I could just show you directly with @proto browser. Here is my domain @://t3.gg. Let's command plus this a bit. Again, it's basically an alternative to HTTP. It is built on top of it, but the atmosphere protocol is interesting. There's the PDS collection, which is the service that hosts all of the data for things like Bluesky. You can put your own stuff on there for free right now, which is cool. And you can create your own collections there too. If I go here and I click @bskyfeed posts, here are all of the records for posts that I made. If I click one of these, here is the details for this record. We have the ID for it. We have the value, which is also, as real as I wasn't following you. Your post still showed up, just me replying to a friend. If we go back to, this is the one I was showing before. I'm filming a video about Bluesky today. What should I make sure to mention? Hoping to have a positive React Native spin on it. @type @Bluesky feed post. So you have the type, which lets us know what to expect the shape of this data to be. But you'll see there's nothing else like likes here because I don't own the likes on my post. If somebody likes my post, that's part of their feed, not mine. So if I go back up and I go to Bluesky feed likes, here are all of the likes I've done. Here is me liking this specific post. Can I go to the post? You've never seen this emoji before in my life. Let's find another one that I liked. Does Bluesky like my cat Lucy? Lucy just got a video feature. I'm sure she'll love that. But these are all the things I've liked. This does have negatives though, because you can see like who I'm blocking as well. You can get a lot of data from here because it's all part of this open data protocol. I like how Dan put it here. @proto is kind of like, what if every app worked like Google Reader? Since this is an open protocol, it's an open standard, anyone can post anything here. The catch is a given one of these collections, which is a reverse URL. I forgot the name for when you do URLs like this, but it's a pretty common thing for application development and protocol referencing. app.bluesky.actor.profile is bluesky.app's collection here, and that collection can have a schema defined that describes what you can post to it. So in the case of a profile, it has a record that is, in this case, self, which has an avatar, which has blob content, which is the actual blob for my image here, a description, and a display name. And that's all data that every profile self record will have because it's typed that way. I can also go to my repost records, which shows everything I've reposted. And a repost has a type, a subject, and a URI. Hopefully it's starting to make sense what this is. It's a way of defining this URL points to this schema, and now anyone can post something that matches that schema to their owned instance here. And this is a very, very open standard. You can go to @proto.com and quick start and build your own app for free on top of this protocol that would just add it in on the app there. So if I wanted, I could make gg.t3.feed here as my own version of a feed, post things to that with my own app, and then read them from somewhere else. And what's cool about this is this data storage layer exists outside of any given app. If Bluesky was to fail and this data was also hosted somewhere else, the data would still be there and I could make my own view for it. People have been making their own custom clients for Bluesky constantly because you can just access the data. It's if the way that Twitter used to work with the API was a certain level of openness and a certain level of you can do what you want to build on top of it. They went one direction, which was locking it down. This is what if they went the other direction and they opened it up way, way more. And Dan Abramov, being the ultimate nerd as well as educator, has covered this stuff really, really well. @proto aha moments. You can host your data. It's just JSON. It's typed, but any app dev can invent those types. Records have URIs. Records are signed, so cacheable without trust. Relay aggregates everyone's events into a global stream, and the backend subscribes to the relay and updates local databases. That's a lot, but I want to showcase one of my favorite parts, which is you can have an actual fire hose again. This is all of the things currently being posted on Bluesky. And if I scroll, we can stop and see what's being posted. But this is a WebSocket just taking in the entirety of that data that anyone can consume and do whatever they want with. I think that is incredibly cool. Twitter used to have a Firehose API. It's basically inaccessible at this point, but the fact that you can just see all of this is dope. And the way it actually works for Bluesky is the app proto exists outside of their servers, and their server is just ingesting the Firehose of data from all of those sources externally, and then turns that into the actual data graph that they need to navigate. So something like this post, remember how I said before, likes don't exist on the post. Likes exist on a user's profile. So how do we get these 752 likes? How is it that when I like it, now it has 753 likes, and when I refresh, it's still there and it loads relatively quick? The reason for that is they are replicating the data that comes through that Firehose in order to make a data graph in the app itself that is a little more performant. Because if I had to look up every single piece of data to find everyone who might have liked this post to generate that like count on every single page load, this would be actually impossible. But if you use the protocol to get the data and then build a cache layer or build a data layer in your app that better fits your app's needs, this is just a source externally. It's a really interesting way of thinking about how to architect your apps, where the data lives outside of your database and server, and the users write data to that external source, and then it gets fed through your app. It's very interesting, but it enables us to be less dependent on these specific platforms and for us to build our own different apps, our own clients, our own data models, all with the same source of truth. So if it turns out Bluesky is evil and we want to move off it somewhere else, we don't lose all of those things. Honestly, the stuff here is so interesting, I could do a dedicated video on @proto, but I hope this helps you understand what's going on here, and also why that middle piece that I was drawing out here, the Bluesky servers themselves, aren't all that interesting, because they're effectively just taking the Firehose and turning that into a better data model that the app can hit without falling over. But what I'm excited about here is that I miss RSS. I miss the days where these things on the internet were open standards that I could just funnel into something else. And as we've segmented the web out of the browser and into these dedicated boxes like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, the data lives in that box. It's not outside of it at all. With RSS, the data lived at a higher level, and the apps that we read the data from could change, and it was fine. Finally, there's a new way to hoist data that isn't just dumping text, but actually lets you have more complex relations and types and ways of building things that we can bake into apps in various different ways. That all said, the reason Bluesky is successful isn't because the tech is super cool. It's because people are tired of Twitter and want something new, and Bluesky currently represents that new thing. That all said, historically, the internet's success hasn't come from people trying out things because they're interesting. It's come from a core of nerds pushing the limits of what the tech can do, and then a nice little interface gets built on top and everyone starts using it. I see a potential here for that to happen. There is no guarantee. Bluesky might die in a week or a year or be around forever, but at the very least, these new open standards and protocols are incredibly promising, and it's dope to see an app make it to #1 on the App Store, showing all of their work and building in a way that makes it really easy to build your own alternative to them. It's the thing I fell in love with software for, this idea of an open way of building and reusing people's work and building on top of these foundations. It's so cool. And I'm curious if you guys think it's as cool as I do. Let me know. And until next time, peace, nerds.